The woman on the bench wasn't moving. That's what Thomas Callahan noticed first. Not her thin coat, not the carpet bag clutched in her white-knuckled grip, not even the way snow had begun to settle on her shoulders like a burial shroud. No, it was the stillness, the kind of stillness that meant a person had stopped fighting. And out here in Wyoming territory in the winter of 1889, when you stopped fighting, you died. Thomas had seen that look before. He'd worn it himself once, years ago, when he had nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn refusal to quit. Now he had everything. 20,000 acres, 300 head of cattle, a ranch house that could swallow a small town. And somehow he still felt like that broke kid with nothing to lose. Funny how money couldn't buy you out of loneliness. But right now, standing on that frozen platform with the wind cutting through his sheepskin coat like a blade, Thomas wasn't thinking about his problems. He was thinking about hers. He approached slowly, boots crunching on ice. "Miss, you waiting on someone?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. Her lips had gone the color of a winter sky, pale blue, bloodless. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He crouched down in front of her, close enough to see the frost clinging to her eyelashes. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyes finally moved, focusing on him with the slow, dreamlike confusion of someone slipping away. "Garrett," she whispered. "I'm here for Garrett Webb." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Garrett Webb. He knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name now. 3 days ago, Garrett had been crushed when a logging chain snapped. They'd buried him yesterday in ground so frozen they had to use pickaxes, and this woman, this frozen, half-dead woman, had come all the way from God knows where to marry a corpse. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. "Iris. Iris Whitmore." Her voice cracked on her own name. I came on the train. They said he'd be here. They said—" She stopped, her breath hitching. "They told me at the telegraph office. 3 days dead. 3 days." A sound escaped her throat, something between a laugh and a sob. "I sold everything I had for the train ticket. Everything. I have 17 cents left and nowhere." Her words dissolved into shivering. Thomas looked around the empty platform. The station master had already locked up for the night. The town beyond was dark, windows glowing with the kind of warmth that wasn't meant for strangers, especially not a woman alone with no husband, no money, no one to vouch for her. The next train east wouldn't come for 6 days, and she'd be dead by morning if she stayed out here. He knew what he had to do. He also knew it was possibly the most foolish decision he'd make all year. But Thomas Callahan hadn't built an empire by playing it safe. "Come with me," he said, standing up and offering his hand. "I've got a ranch about an hour out. You can stay there until you figure out what's next." Iris stared at his hand like it was a mirage. "I can't pay you. I'm not asking you to. You don't know me. I could be." "You're freezing to death on a train platform in the middle of nowhere," Thomas interrupted. "And I'm not the kind of man who leaves people to die when I can help. Now you can come with me, or you can sit here and let the cold take you. Your choice." The words hung in the frozen air between them. For a moment, Thomas thought she might refuse, might choose the dignity of freezing over the uncertainty of trusting a stranger. But then her hand moved, trembling, and slipped into his. Her fingers were ice through his glove. He pulled her to her feet, grabbed her carpet bag, and guided her toward his wagon. "Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story of survival and second chances is reaching." Are you watching from a warm room tonight, or are you somewhere cold like Iris was? Let me know down below. The ride to the ranch was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels and Iris's labored breathing. Thomas kept glancing at her, watching the way she swayed with each bump in the road, barely conscious. He pushed the horses harder. When the ranch finally came into view, sprawling and grand with lamplight glowing from a dozen windows, Iris didn't react. She was past seeing it. Thomas carried her inside, calling for his housekeeper. Mrs. Brennan appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a woman who'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by much, but even she froze when she saw the half-conscious woman in Thomas's arms. "What in heaven's name?" "She needs a warm bed and hot broth," Thomas said, heading for the stairs. "She's been out in the cold too long." "Thomas Callahan, you can't just bring strange women into this house." "I just did." His tone left no room for argument. Mrs. Brennan muttered something about foolish men and bleeding hearts, but she followed him up the stairs, already barking orders, to the housemaid about hot water and blankets. They put Iris in the small guest room at the end of the hall. Mrs. Brennan shooed Thomas out while she helped Iris out of her frozen clothes and into a warm nightgown. Thomas stood in the hallway, listening to Iris's weak protests, her mumbled apologies, her confused questions about where she was. He'd saved her life tonight. He knew that. But as he stood there in his big, empty house, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, she might end up saving his too. 3 days later, Iris finally woke up fully. The fever that had gripped her was gone, leaving her weak but clear-headed. She found herself in a room she didn't recognize, wearing clothes that weren't hers, in a house that felt more like a hotel than a home. When she finally made it downstairs, clutching the banister for support, she found Thomas in his study, staring at ledgers like they held answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Iris said the only thing she could think to say. "Thank you. You saved my life." Thomas closed the ledger. "You're welcome. How are you feeling?" "Like I died and came back." She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I should go. I've imposed enough." "Go where?" The question was gentle, but pointed. "You have 17 cents and no ticket. Spring thaw is months away. The roads are impassable half the time. You'd freeze before you made it 5 miles. He stood up, crossing to the window. "Stay here until spring. Figure out your next move when the world thaws out a little." Iris felt tears prick her eyes. Kindness from strangers was harder to bear than cruelty. At least cruelty made sense. "I can't just live here as your charity case." "Then don't," Thomas said simply. "Earn your keep if it makes you feel better. Mrs. Brennan could use help around the house, or—" He hesitated. "You could just rest. God knows you've been through enough." But Iris Whitmore didn't know how to rest. She'd spent 2 years watching her first husband die slowly of consumption, powerless to stop it despite all her training as a nurse. She'd fled west to escape the ghost of that failure, only to find another death waiting for her. Rest felt like surrender, and she'd already surrendered enough. That's when she heard the coughing. Somewhere in the house, someone was coughing hard enough to rattle windows. Iris's instincts kicked in before her mind could catch up. She was moving toward the sound before Thomas could stop her, following it to the kitchen, where a young ranch hand, barely more than a boy, was doubled over, hacking into his elbow, his face flushed with fever. And, just like that, Iris Whitmore found her purpose again. But here's the question I want you to think about. Can a woman who couldn't save the man she loved find redemption by saving strangers? Or will the ghosts of her past catch up to her before she gets the chance. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think happens next. The boy's name was Lyle, and he was dying. Not slowly, not peacefully, violently, the way winter killed out here when it decided you were done. His fever had spiked to the point where he didn't recognize his own name, and the ranch hands who'd carried him into the kitchen were looking at each other with the kind of helpless panic that said they'd already written him off. Men who could break horses and brand cattle without flinching turned into scared children when faced with something they couldn't rope or shoot. But Iris Whitmore had spent 2 years watching death try to claim someone she loved. And she'd learned every trick, every strategy, every desperate gamble to hold it back. Death had won that fight. She wasn't about to let it win this one. "Get me hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey," Iris snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos like a whip crack. The men stared at her. She was still weak from her own brush with death, still pale, still wearing borrowed clothes that hung loose on her frame. But there was steel in her voice now, the kind of authority that comes from standing in the valley of shadows and refusing to blink. "Now," she added when no one moved. Mrs. Brennan was the first to respond, already heating water on the stove. The ranch hands scrambled to follow orders, and just like that, Iris was in control. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching. He'd been about to send someone to fetch the doctor from town, knowing full well the man wouldn't come in weather like this for a mere ranch hand. But now he just watched Iris work, and something shifted in his chest. A recognition, maybe, or a revelation. This woman, who'd been half dead on a train platform 3 days ago, had just transformed into something fierce and purposeful. She moved with the precision of a soldier in battle, checking Lyle's pulse, peeling back his eyelids to check his pupils, pressing her hand to his forehead with a focus that shut out everything else in the room. "His fever's too high," Iris muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "We need to bring it down fast or he'll seize." She turned to Mrs. Brennan. "I need cool water and ice if you have it, and something to elevate his feet." To Thomas, without looking at him, "Does he have any medical history? Any conditions I should know about?" Thomas had to clear his throat to find his voice. "He had pneumonia last winter, barely survived it." Iris's jaw tightened. "Then his lungs are already compromised. This is going to be close." She began stripping Lyle's sweat-soaked shirt off, revealing a chest that rose and fell too rapidly, too shallowly. She soaked cloths in the cool water and began placing them strategically: neck, armpits, groin, the places where blood ran closest to the surface. The ranch hands watched in silence, torn between fascination and discomfort at seeing a woman work with such unflinching intimacy. But Iris wasn't thinking about propriety. She was thinking about the rhythm of his breathing, the pattern of his pulse, the signs his body was giving her about whether he'd see sunrise. The night stretched long and brutal. Iris never left Lyle's side, monitoring his fever, changing the cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. Thomas brought her coffee at midnight and found her singing quietly. An old hymn he half remembered from childhood. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and he realized she was singing, not for Lyle, but for herself. A way to mark time, to stay awake, to keep the darkness at bay. He set the coffee down without a word, and left. But he didn't go far. He spent that night in the hallway outside the kitchen, listening to the sounds of her battle against death, feeling useless and oddly humbled. By dawn, Lyle's fever broke. The moment Iris felt his forehead cool under her palm, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The boy opened his eyes, confused and weak but alive. "Where?" he started, his voice a rasp. "You're safe," Iris said, and her own voice shook with exhaustion and relief. "You're going to be fine!" She stood up too quickly, and the room tilted. Thomas caught her before she hit the floor, his arms steadying her as her legs gave out. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd found her at the station, she smiled. It was a tired, fragile thing. But it was real. "You did it," Thomas said quietly. "We did it," Iris corrected, though they both knew the truth. She'd done something Thomas couldn't have done with all his money and all his power. She'd saved a life with nothing but knowledge, determination, and a refusal to quit. And in that moment, Thomas Callahan realized he was looking at the most valuable thing that had ever set foot on his ranch. Word spread fast. Within a week, ranch hands were showing up at the main house with ailments they'd been ignoring for months. Infected cuts that had gone septic, frostbite turning fingers black, chronic coughs that rattled lungs like stones in a tin can. Iris treated them all. She set up a makeshift infirmary in a spare room, organizing supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. She refused payment, which frustrated Thomas to no end. "These men barely make enough to survive," she argued when he pressed the issue. "I won't take what little they have." "Then let me pay you," Thomas countered. They were standing in what had become her medical room, surrounded by bandages and bottles of medicine he'd ordered from back east. "You're working yourself to exhaustion for free. That's not sustainable." Iris turned to face him, her expression complicated. "I don't want your charity, Thomas. It's not charity. It's payment for services rendered. There's a difference." He pulled out a small leather pouch and set it on the table. "Take it. Use it to buy better supplies if you won't use it on yourself. But take it." She stared at the pouch for a long moment, then picked it up. "Fine. But this goes to medicine and equipment. Nothing else." Thomas smiled. "You're stubborn. I've been called worse." She almost smiled back, and there it was again. That spark between them. The thing neither of them was ready to name. It hung in the air like smoke, visible but untouchable. And then Mrs. Brennan called from downstairs about dinner, and the moment passed. But it didn't disappear. It just waited. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Iris healed. Thomas managed his empire, and somewhere in between, they began to exist in each other's orbit. He started bringing her books from his library, medical texts at first, then novels, then poetry she pretended not to read, but always finished. She started joining him for dinner, and their conversations stretched longer each night, moving from polite small talk to something deeper, more honest. He told her about building the ranch from nothing, about losing his parents young and deciding that wealth would be his armor against the world's cruelty. She told him about her first husband, about the 2 years she spent watching consumption hollow him out, about the guilt that still lived in her chest because part of her had been relieved when he finally died. "Does that make me terrible?" she asked one night, staring into the fireplace. They were alone in the sitting room, the house quiet around them. "It makes you human," Thomas said. "Love and relief aren't mutually exclusive. Neither are grief and gratitude." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You gave him everything you had. That's more than most people give in a lifetime. You're allowed to reclaim your life afterward." Iris looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. Understanding. Not pity, not judgment. Understanding. This man, with his wealth and his land and his carefully constructed walls, understood what it meant to survive something that should have killed you. She felt something shift in her chest, something warm and terrifying and inevitable. "What are you afraid of, Thomas?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He met her eyes. That I'll die alone in this big house with all my money and nothing that matters. What are you afraid of, Iris? She didn't hesitate. That I'll finally have something worth living for and lose it again. Their hands were inches apart on the sofa. Neither of them moved to close the distance, but neither moved away. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied, and in that moment, Iris Whitmore felt something she thought she'd buried with her first husband: hope. Dangerous, foolish, beautiful hope. But hope, as it turns out, has enemies. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Mrs. Brennan brought it to Iris while she was treating a ranch hand for a twisted ankle. The envelope was expensive paper, the handwriting precise and aggressive. Iris opened it with hands that somehow already knew to shake. The words inside hit her like a fist to the stomach. Miss Whitmore, you are hereby notified that as the legal inheritor of my late brother Garrett Webb's estate and debts, I am entitled to enforcement of the marriage contract between yourself and the deceased. You will present yourself at my office in Blackwater within 14 days to fulfill your legal and financial obligations, or I will be forced to pursue legal remedies, including charges of fraud and theft. Regards, Silas Webb, Esquire. Iris read it 3 times. Each time the words got worse. Silas Webb, Garrett's brother, was claiming she owed him. Owed him money she'd never taken. Owed him a marriage to a dead man. Owed him her future, because a piece of paper said so. And the worst part, men like Silas could twist the law into whatever shape served them. She'd seen it before. Women had no standing, no power, no voice when men decided to exercise their authority. She could fight, but she'd lose. She always lost, unless she disappeared first. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Iris began packing her carpet bag. She moved quietly, methodically, her hands steady even as her heart raced. She'd leave before dawn, head into town, figure something out. She'd survived this long. She'd survive longer. She had to. But as she folded her borrowed clothes, because even these weren't hers, nothing was hers, the door opened behind her. Thomas stood in the doorway, still dressed, like he'd known. Maybe he had. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. Iris didn't turn around. "I have to." "No, you don't. You don't understand." "Then explain it to me." His voice was quiet but firm. "Tell me what has you so scared that you're willing to run back into the cold." And so she told him. About Silas, about the letter, about the impossible choice between submitting to a man who saw her as property or running forever. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with each word. When she finished, he walked over to her and gently took the clothes from her hands, setting them aside. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Thomas, you don't understand what men like Silas—" "I understand perfectly." His voice hardened. "I understand that he's a bully using the law as a weapon. I understand that you think you have to face this alone. But here's what you don't understand, Iris." He took her hands in his, and his grip was warm and solid and real. "You brought life back to this ranch. You saved Lyle. You've healed dozens of men who had given up on being healed. You've made this empty house feel like a home for the first time in 20 years. His voice cracked slightly. "And somewhere along the way, you made me remember what it feels like to hope for something beyond tomorrow." Iris felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I can't let you fight my battles." "Then fight with me. Not alone. With me." He pulled her closer. "My money's never meant a damn thing except to buy cattle and land. Let me use it for something that actually matters. Let me stand between you and whatever comes. Not because you need saving. You're the strongest person I've ever met. But because you shouldn't have to face everything alone anymore." She looked up at him, This lonely millionaire cowboy who'd pulled her back from the edge of death and somehow fallen into the chasm with her. And she realized that maybe surviving wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to try living. "I'm so afraid," she whispered. "Me too," Thomas admitted, "but let's be afraid together." And when he kissed her forehead, gentle and certain, Iris Whitmore stopped running, but Silas Webb was already on his way, and he was bringing the law with him. The question wasn't whether Silas Webb would come. The question was whether Thomas and Iris would be ready when he did. And as it turned out, ready or not, fate had a way of forcing your hand. Silas arrived on a gray morning when the sky looked like old dishwater and the wind carried the promise of more snow. He didn't come alone. He brought a marshal, a thin, nervous man named Dobbs who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. And he brought an audience. Word had spread through the territory that something was about to happen at the Callahan Ranch, and a dozen men from town had ridden out to watch the show. Because out here, where entertainment was scarce and winters were long, other people's misery was the best spectacle available. Iris saw them from the window of her medical room. Her hands froze mid-bandage on a ranch hand's arm, her breath catching in her throat. She'd known this moment was coming. Thomas had assured her repeatedly over the past week that he had a plan, that his lawyers had been working day and night, that everything would be fine. But knowing and believing were two different things. And right now, watching Silas Webb dismount from his horse with the smug confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards, Iris felt belief slip through her fingers like water. Thomas appeared beside her, his presence solid and grounding. "Stay here," he said quietly. "No." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "If this is about me, I'm not hiding." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we face him together." They walked out onto the porch, side by side, and Iris felt every eye turn toward her. She'd been stared at before. When her first husband died, when she arrived in town as a mail-order bride for a dead man, every time she walked down a street alone. But this felt different. This felt like standing in front of a firing squad. Silas Webb was a thick man with a face like raw meat and eyes that calculated everything in terms of profit and loss. He looked at Iris the way a butcher looks at livestock, and she felt her skin crawl. "Miss Whitmore," Silas said, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. "I'm glad to see you're still here. Saves me the trouble of tracking you down." "State your business, Webb," Thomas said flatly. "You're on my property." Silas smiled without warmth. "My business is with the lady. She entered into a legal contract with my late brother, and I'm here to see that contract honored." He pulled papers from his coat. "She took money for passage west with the promise of marriage. My brother's dead, but his debts and his rights pass to me. She owes me recompense, either in marriage or in coin." His smile widened. "And since she's got no coin, well, I'm a generous man. I'll honor my brother's arrangement." The words hung in the cold air like poison. Iris felt rage flood through her, burning away the fear. "I didn't take a cent from your brother beyond the train ticket which he sent. I owe you nothing." "That's not what the law says, miss. Marshal Dobbs here will confirm. The contract is binding." Dobbs shifted uncomfortably. "Well, technically the language in these old bride contracts can be interpreted. Can be interpreted as null and void," Thomas interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. He descended the porch steps, and there was something in his bearing that made even Silas take a half-step back. "Since you want to play lawyer, Webb, let's talk law. Your brother died before the marriage took place. The contract required a living groom and a willing bride. You've got neither. What you've got is a fraudulent claim and an attempt at coercion. He pulled his own papers from his coat. My attorney has reviewed the contract. It's worthless. Miss Whitmore owes you nothing. Silas's face darkened. Your attorney is as crooked as you are, Callahan. Everyone knows you bought every judge and lawman within 100 miles. I don't need to buy anyone, Thomas said calmly. The law's on my side, but even if it wasn't, even if you had a legitimate claim, which you don't, you'd still have to go through me to get to her. And Webb. Thomas took another step forward. I promise you don't want to try. The tension crackled like lightning about to strike. The ranch hands had gathered now, forming a silent wall behind Thomas and Iris. These were men she'd healed, men who remembered fevered nights and infected wounds and her gentle hands bringing them back from the edge. They weren't going to let anyone take her. And Silas, looking at 30 armed cowboys who'd decided which side they were on, seemed to finally understand that he'd miscalculated badly. This isn't over, Silas snarled, but it was the sound of a man who knew he'd already lost. I'll take this to every court in the territory. Do that, Thomas said. You'll lose every time, but you're welcome to waste your money trying. He turned his back on Silas, the ultimate dismissal, and offered his arm to Iris. Come on. We've got better things to do than listen to a desperate man make threats he can't keep. Iris took his arm, and together they walked back into the house. Behind them, she heard Silas cursing, heard Marshal Dobbs quietly suggesting they leave, heard the murmur of disappointed spectators who'd come hoping for drama and got a legal lecture instead. When the door closed behind them, Iris finally let herself breathe. Is it really over? She asked. Thomas turned to her, and his expression was tender in a way that still surprised her. The legal part. Yes. Webb has no claim on you. You're free. He paused. But that brings us to another question. What question? What you're going to do with that freedom. He took both her hands in his. Iris. These past months you've brought something to this ranch that all my money couldn't buy. You've brought purpose, you've brought healing, you've brought life. His voice roughened. You've brought me back to life, and I know you came here running from grief, looking for escape. I know you didn't plan on staying, but I'm asking you to stay anyway. Not as my guest, not as my employee, as my partner, my equal, my wife. Iris felt tears blur her vision. Thomas, I'm terrified of losing someone again. I know. I'm terrified of being alone again. But being terrified together has to be better than being terrified apart. He smiled, and it transformed his whole face. Marry me, Iris. Not because you owe me anything. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Marry me because when I look at you, I see the future I didn't know I wanted. Marry me because together we can build something that matters. A ranch that doesn't just raise cattle, but raises people up. A legacy of compassion. And Iris Whitmore, who'd thought her heart was too broken to risk again, found herself saying yes. Yes to hope. Yes to love. Yes to the terrifying, beautiful possibility of a future worth fighting for. When Thomas kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never been but had always belonged. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later. Mrs. Brennan threw herself into preparations, with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting 20 years for Thomas to make a decent decision. The ranch hands built a small chapel on the property. Not much more than a barn, really, but with windows that caught the light just right and benches carved from wood that still smelled like pine. Iris spent her days treating patients and her nights planning a future she'd stopped believing in months ago. And Thomas spent every spare moment watching her come alive, realizing that saving her at that train station hadn't been charity. It had been the smartest thing he'd ever done. But 2 days before the wedding, a rider came thundering up to the ranch, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold. Iris saw him from the chapel, where she was arranging wildflowers, and something in his urgency made her stomach drop. She ran toward the main house, arriving just as the rider was delivering his message to Thomas. "Scarlet fever!" the rider gasped. "Whole town of Redemption's got it. The doctor's dead. Took it first. There's children dying, Mr. Callahan. Dozens of them. They're desperate. They heard about the nurse you got here. They're begging for help." Iris felt the world tilt. Scarlet fever, one of the deadliest diseases that could tear through a frontier town. She'd read about it in her medical texts, knew the symptoms, knew the treatments that might work and the ones that wouldn't. But she also knew the mortality rate, knew that going into that town meant walking into a plague house with no guarantee she'd walk back out. Knew that the wedding she'd been planning, the future she'd been building, the man she'd finally allowed herself to love, all of it could end in a mass grave in a town called Redemption. She looked at Thomas, saw the fear in his eyes, but also saw something else. Acceptance, understanding. He knew what she had to do before she said it. "We have to go," Iris said quietly. Thomas didn't hesitate. "Then we go together. Thomas, you could die. So could you. And I'm not letting you walk into hell without me." He turned to the rider. "Tell them we're coming. Tell them to quarantine the sick, boil all water, and prepare a building we can use as a hospital. We'll be there by nightfall." Iris felt something break open in her chest. Not fear, but something bigger, fiercer. This was the moment she'd been running from since her husband died. The moment where she had to choose between safety and purpose, between protecting herself and saving others. And standing here with Thomas Callahan, who'd offered her everything and was now willing to risk it all beside her, she finally understood what love actually meant. It wasn't about finding someone to hide with. It was about finding someone worth fighting beside. As they mounted their horses and rode toward a dying town and an uncertain fate, Iris thought about that frozen girl on the train platform who'd given up on everything. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned that sometimes you have to walk through fire to find out what you're made of, and whatever waited in redemption, death or salvation, tragedy or triumph, she wouldn't face it alone. The prairie stretched before them, vast and unforgiving. Somewhere ahead, children were dying, and somewhere behind them, a wedding waited that might never happen. But right now, in this moment, Iris Whitmore was exactly where she needed to be, riding toward the fight of her life with a man who loved her enough to die beside her. And if you want to know whether they survive what's waiting in redemption, whether the wedding ever happens, whether love is enough when death comes calling, well, you're going to have to come back for part 2. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell because this story is just getting started. Drop a comment and tell me, would you ride into a plague town to save strangers, or would you choose safety? I want to know, and trust me, after what happens next, you're going to want to be here for every moment. This is Mr. Wild West, where the frontier was brutal, love was fierce, and survival was never guaranteed. I'll see you in the next one.